are already familiar with the impressive academic credentials of tonight's speaker, Dr. John Marciari. So I thought that instead I would give you a little glimpse into the day in the life of John Marciari.
Oh, no.
And also to introduce you to a side of him that you may not know. So let's start with a day in the life of John, and let's just start with yesterday because it's particularly interesting. Yesterday, John woke up at 5 a.m. and ran 20 miles.
It's only 13.
Oh, it's 13. That's taking the drama out of my story. Okay.
I just wanted to be honest.
Okay, 13 miles. At 9 a.m., that's only 4 hours later, he dropped his son Jack off at the Titanic exhibition over at the Natural History Museum. He then joined the design and installation crew here at the museum for fine-tuning, checking the lighting, checking the labels, checking the credit lines, checking all the accession numbers on the objects for the Human Beast exhibition. As an aside, I talked to our exhibition designer about trying to get some insights as to some of the things that John fusses about before an exhibition opens, and that person responded to me, "What doesn't he fuss about?" John then picked Jack up, his son, at noon, and his daughter Beatty right after that. He came back to the office yesterday afternoon, worked on tonight's PowerPoint exhibition, then went upstairs to do final checks with the crew, checked to see that the floor was dust and crumb-free. Thank you, Julianne Marco. At 5:30, he led the first exhibition pre-tour for a group of 30 donors, lenders, and dignitaries of the museum. At 6:30, he led the second pre-tour for another group of 30 donors, lenders, and dignitaries. And at 7:30, he finally enjoyed a beer at the opening celebration. He greeted guests. He had a chance to catch up with Melissa Kondon, the daughter of Dr. Vance Kondon, whom you're going to learn about in a bit, and certainly to say thank you to her family. At 9 p.m., he attended a dinner with the visiting dignitaries and sat with the Deputy Consul of Germany from Los Angeles. He got home, we figure, about midnight. He did not go running this morning. True?
That's true.
At 9:30 a.m. this morning, he led a tour of the exhibition for the docents and the frontline staff at the museum. At noon, he had lunch with his son and his daughter. At 1 p.m., he finally was able... What?
And you.
Oh, and me too. At 1 p.m., he answered email from the last couple of days. He worked on his book. As you all know, he is in the midst of writing a fantastic and very important catalog about the museum's Spanish and Italian paintings, which will, I believe, for the first time, really put our old masters in their proper context with these paintings from around the world. And he double-checked his PowerPoint for tonight. At 3 p.m., he led a staff tour of the exhibition. At 5 p.m., he was in this room checking the AV equipment. And now at 6 o'clock, he'll begin his PowerPoint presentation for all of us. At 7:15, we hope he'll get to enjoy another beer. Now, keep in mind that his schedule over the last 2 days is a near exact repeat of what he did only 1 month ago, on June 7th and 8th, for the opening of the Invention of Glory, that beautiful tapestries show, which I hope you will take a moment to see if you haven't been able to do so already. However, tonight we are in the world of 20th century Germany and Austria rather than 15th century Belgium, Spain, and Portugal, which should speak to John's incredible context and capacity to think about lots of different forms of art. But I will put this into greater context because this again is a repeat of what he did last summer, when our exhibitions Gustav Stickley in the American Arts and Crafts movement, and From El Greco to Dali, great Spanish masters from the Pérez Simón collection, opened in June and July, respectively. John works very hard for this institution. But I do want to give you just one couple little more insights about John. So I share the following. John recently led a tour of his alumni colleagues from Yale through Italy. And at one of the dinners, apparently, they played a guessing game where they had to guess how old he was, and also what astrological sign he was. And apparently, while the age guesses ranged anywhere from early 20s to, God forbid, 50, every single person guessed that he was a Cancer, a sign known for their exacting nature, their moodiness, their sensitivity, their independence, and their fierce loyalty. John is a rare curator who thinks beyond the individual works of art and to the context of the institutions in which those artists and those objects live. He derives satisfaction from being part of the legacy that collectors like Dr. Vance Kondon have created with this institution. This is the legacy that gives the San Diego Museum of Art increasingly international relevance. An ancient Greek proverb says that a society grows great when men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. While we do hope that John will be able to enjoy some of the metaphorical shade created by his work, it is this kind of selfless, rigorous, long-term thinking that makes John one of the greatest assets of this institution. For a long time, John had a quote taped to his office door downstairs. It said, "I yell because I care." And he does care, and we are very grateful for that, and we are very lucky to have Dr. John Marciari speaking for us tonight.
I'm not really sure whether I can live up to that in the end. Yes. That's your phone.
Yes.
This would be a good time to remind everyone to shut their phones off if you're still carrying them around, I suppose. At some point in the last 24 hours, I was asked by someone on Katie's team whether what did I have to say? What did I want to help with her introduction of me? And I pointed out that I didn't really have time to think about that right now, which may have been part of the inspiration for that, which was surely the strangest introduction I've ever received, but also the most lovely, really. We actually are a big, happy family here, as I think you get some sense of from events like tonight. With all of that, I've sort of lost my train of thought, but I'll try to reconstruct it quickly. What I want to do tonight is give you the background to the exhibition, how it happened, what it's all about, and then, in a way, lead you through it in a way that physically wouldn't be possible with this many people. It would just be physically impossible to squeeze all of you in front of one work of art and talk about it at one time. But I hope that this is just an introduction, that you'll take what I say tonight and go after a drink, and yes, I do like beer more than wine, into the exhibition, because even tonight with the slides, I'll mention perhaps 15 or 20 of the 90 some odd works that are in the exhibition. There's so many stories to tell in German Expressionism, and so many stories to tell about this exhibition and the gifts that make it possible, that all I can really do tonight is begin to scratch the surface. And indeed, the exhibition itself is really a first draft, you might say, for a future cataloging of this part of the collection. We received the bequest of 48 works from the Kondon-Giesberger families last year, but we received the works, and that's it. Not a single shred of documentation came along with them. So this is very much a work in progress as the process of researching these works, both in terms of where they came from and a fuller understanding of them, is still the work of several more years. So that, I suppose, is a way of preempting the inevitable question of whether we plan a catalog for this. What we want to do was celebrate as quickly as possible the amazing gift that came from Vance Kondon and his widow, Elizabeth Giesberger. That was more important than holding off and producing a show after such time as we had to research and prepare a longer catalog. But that catalog still is somewhere down the road, I hope, to come. What I want to do tonight, though, is talk about the making of the exhibition, as I've said. And the story begins last April, when literally out of the blue, unexpectedly, we received a letter from Spira and Hazenberg of Amsterdam, notaries public, written not to any particular person, but just to the director's office. And the letter began, "With this letter, I wish to inform you of the bequest that was made on behalf of the San Diego Museum of Art by Mrs. Elizabeth Giesberger." Now, there's not a single person in the administration or curatorial ranks of this museum who had any idea whatsoever who Elizabeth Giesberger was. After all, she's lived in Amsterdam since 1990, and none of us were even in San Diego back then, much less at the museum. So one continues reading this letter, and finally, on the second page, it gets to the details of what this bequest would be. And it says, I bequeath all those objects of art from my collection of early 20th century German art as described in their, that is to say, the museum's catalog of 28 January to 11 March 1984. So we're going fairly back into museum history, to what some of you will remember as the Brezzo days. And we went and consulted that catalog, a very slim little catalog, mainly a few pictures and a checklist with a short introductory essay by Ida Rigby, the local scholar at San Diego State, who is one of the great experts on German Expressionism. And we were frankly floored to discover that it would include 4 works by Otto Dix, a watercolor by, examples ranging from watercolors to oil paintings, a great painting by Max Pechstein, an erotic drawing by Schiele, 2 drawings by Klimt, 5 paintings by Gabriele Munter. The riches of this collection, which none of us had ever heard of, were astronomical, and it literally came out of the blue. No one saw this coming. So that leads to the inevitable question, well, who the hell is Vance Kondon, and what is this all about? Fortunately, at the time of the 1984 exhibition, he did a number of interviews with the LA Times and the San Diego UT about his collection being on view, and I've been able to call some information from that, also talking to some people who were around in those days. There's a picture of Vance Kondon from the Museum magazine of early 1985, and he explained to the newspapers, as he explained in the talk that was advertised there, that he got turned on to the Expressionists because they were a kind of revolutionary and exciting and forthright and down-to-earth painters. There's a vitality in their work. They're a kind of sensual people. The inevitable grammatical mistakes that come from being interviewed by the local newspaper. I was fascinated by the fresh images, their vibrant use of colors, and the exciting manner in which they depicted startling events. And here's the key line. These were not pretty pictures you would expect to see in some bourgeois home. And that is one of the key aspects of German Expressionism, which he realized right from the start. That's what the artists themselves were all about. In a different interview the previous year, he was even more concrete, and he explained, when I first saw Grant and Walbridge's collection, I was struck by his German Expressionists. There was one work in particular, a brilliantly colored painting by Jelensky, that completely knocked me out. The painting in question is the large variation autumn landscape by Jelensky that has, since the 80s, been part of the Museum of Art's collection, but which, when Vance Kondon, as a young doctor, first moved to San Diego in 1953, was still on the walls of the Walbridge home in La Jolla. And one of the really special things about this exhibition is how Vance Kondon's collection was inspired by the Walbridge collection, which came here after the fact, which came as gifts to the museum through the 80s and 90s. Now, the Kondon collection, which was exhibited here in the 80s, has come home to roost. But there's even more to this story of legacies of San Diego collectors. Because the Walbridge collection, which was truly great and included modernism of all sorts, from most of the sculpture in our sculpture garden to American and French modernism to, in the case of German Expressionism, for example, the great George Gross watercolor, with which I'll end this talk today, 3 amazing Nolde watercolors, this very, very important Franz Marc drawing. And the Walbridge collection, in turn, was, you could say, begat in a sort of lineage of collections here in San Diego by the collection put together of Earl Grant, put together at a slightly earlier moment and given to this museum in the 70s as partly as gift and partly as bequest. So there's this amazing lineage of Earl Grant buying these things and Norton Walbridge seeing those, and then Grant gives his collection to the museum. And Walbridge, Norton and Barbara Walbridge, follow and do the same. Vance Kondon sees Walbridge's collection first in his house, and now eventually his collection comes home to roost. And it's this accumulation of private collections which makes museum growth really possible. Even if we had limitless funds for acquisition, and to buy these sorts of works today would cost many, many times more than they did when they were being acquired in the 50s and 60s when German Expressionism hadn't really come into its own, we as a museum could never devote so much resource to buying one after another kind of the same thing. We would buy one German Expressionist, and then we might buy an American Modernist painting, then we might buy an old master, then we might buy an Asian sculpture. It's the nature of museums to spread the acquisitions through all of the departments that are represented in the collection. But the private collectors are able, with this single-minded focus, to build near encyclopedic collections that make huge leaps forward possible when those collections come first as loans to the exhibition, to the museum to be exhibited, and then we hope ultimately as bequests as well. And whether you're talking about the Metropolitan in New York or the San Diego Museum of Art or some little arts center that no one has ever heard of, it's that kind of gift which makes the growth of the permanent collection happen, more than any museum acquisition will ever be able to do. And it's particularly special how these three collections, and you'll see what I mean as I go through the talk tonight, build on one another. The Walbridges bought one kind of German Expressionism that wasn't quite the same thing that Earl Grant was interested in. And then Vance Kondon, who was really interested in the bohemian artist qualities of German Expressionism, of these artists as the guys who were thumbing their nose at the bourgeois. Well, you know, people who knew her tell me you can't really imagine Barbara Walbridge putting a George Grosz caricature on her wall, but you can certainly imagine Vance Kondon buying up print after print, work after work of the more difficult aspects of German Expressionism. And now they all come together. And so with those three collections suddenly in place, we decided it was time to make an exhibition. Now, that sounds fairly easy. It's not quite as simple as a matter of putting it all up on the walls. From the very question of how do you arrange this? Do you show it all chronologically, from the earliest to the latest in one kind of unbroken string on the walls? Expressionism is a fairly short-lived moment in art history. It starts around 1905. It ends in the early 30s with the Nazi rise to power. It's not as though it develops so dramatically from moment to moment to moment that a chronological hang helps to tell the story. Nor does it serve you to put all the works by one artist together. I think, for example, our 7 paintings by Alexei Van-Yolensky are more interesting seen in conversation, in juxtaposition and conversation with works by Munter and Kandinsky and others than they would be if they were simply alone on a wall by themselves. So the decision I made, which is one that is not my invention, is one that has often been used for past exhibitions at other museums of German Expressionism, is to organize it roughly thematically, grouping things into like sections to give a fuller sense of what these artists were thinking and how they were in conversation with one another. It's a real artist movement in the sense that you have artists working side by side, sharing studios, talking about their art, writing about their art. It's not just that they were doing kind of sort of the same thing. I mean, the Italian Renaissance in Florence, we don't know how much contact Filippo Lippi actually had with Botticelli. Yes, they're both working in Florence. Yes, they saw what the other ones were doing, but they're not trying to create something new together. But as is the case with many of the early 20th century movements, as is certainly the case with German Expressionism, you have initially 2 and then merging together and forming a single and then dividing into 3 groups, the artists working as a team, trying to create something new together. And so the exhibition comes to be organized into these sections, each of which I'll go through in my talk tonight. First, Die Brücke and the birth of Expressionism. These artists working in Dresden and Berlin beginning in 1905. Most of them were architecture students rather than trained painters, coming to the fore and creating what we first recognize as Expressionism. At the same time, The Blauer Reiter, starting up in Munich, independently of Die Brücke, but coming up with many of the same ideas and works of the same style. And then, as you see, strictly thematic sections: the nude, war, landscape, religion, mysticism, and fantasy, and then modern life. And here's what this looks like. Most of the rest of the talk is going to be illustrated with works that are actually in the show and, with very few exceptions, works now in our permanent collection, things that'll always be here. So the show begins, as you walk into it, with this painting by Max Pechstein, a double-sided painting. Or I should say, a painting that has two sides. It was not intended to be shown with both sides showing. Instead, Pechstein, like most of these artists, sold so little art, so anti-bourgeois was he that he couldn't actually sell his pictures to the people who had money to buy them. He couldn't afford paints and canvas, so he reused his canvases. So on the back of one picture, you often find another picture that he rejected, he'd moved on, he restretched the canvas and painted on the back. So you'll see, as you walk into the show, the green nude at left, and then as you go around the corner of that wall, the landscape on the right, which will actually be turned 180 degrees. I've had to explain 5 or 6 times today that no, I didn't hang it upside down deliberately, that it's just the back of the canvas on the other side. Clearly, my didactics didn't work in this case. Anyway, I start with this picture, not because it's the earliest, nor even the most important work in the show, but because it shows what German Expressionism was all about, where it came from, what these artists were thinking. It's the best summary of what Die Brücke in particular was about, partly by looking at its influences. So here's this green nude, as we originally called her, until we discovered that, in fact, the proper title for the painting, according to Pechstein, is Magdalena Still Life with Nude, which is a kind of funny inversion. One would think nude with still life, but there's more to that story as well. I think it's meant to make sure that you pay attention to the objects in the back, which we will. And you see at I think, first glance that he's thinking about Paul Gauguin in every way possible, from the style of the picture to the lurid colors of the nude to this, we think, African or Pacific island object as part of that aforementioned still life in the back. Pechstein would also, following in the footsteps of Gauguin, head off to the South Seas, as Gauguin did. He didn't go to Tahiti, but rather to the island of Palau in 1914, but that's still in the future. This painting dates from a few years earlier, 1912. He's also, Pechstein that is, been looking at Matisse. I don't think you can look at this without calling to mind Matisse's great blue nude Souvenir of Biskra in the Kohn collection, now at the Baltimore Museum of Art. This is painted in 1912. Matisse is first exhibited in Berlin in 1910. But one of the things always to keep in mind is that by 1900, European art is international. The artists travel, and their works are known across Europe. They're collected, they're exhibited, and the beginnings of art journals and photography are showing works almost immediately from Prague to Vienna to Berlin to Paris to London to New York and beyond. There is no such thing as a true national school by the time you're talking about the early 20th century. And then also, in addition, or inspired by Gauguin, you have the influence of non-Western art. Remember, these are artists who hadn't trained in the academies. In fact, they deliberately spend as much time in the Anthropological Museum of Dresden as they do in the Fine Arts Museum. And you find, for example, this object, now still in the collection of the Dresden Anthropological Museum, which I believe is possibly the same object, slightly adapted here, or at the very least is very similar in type to that which appears in the background of Pechstein's picture. Now, what's the point of all this? Why follow Gauguin? Why follow Matisse? Why look at non-Western art? And the key idea here is to get to something pure, to something primitive would have been the word that they used. Throw out the conventions of art that have prevailed since the Renaissance. Throw out the classical tradition. That's old, it's stale. That's used for making pretty pictures for bourgeois living room walls, to paraphrase Vance Kondon. Make art that is so radical, is so new, that it shocks people, that it makes them look at art a different way and ultimately makes them look at the modern world in a different way. Because the modernism of German Expressionism is not only that of the visual arts, it's that of literature, of music. We'll talk a lot about music, of cinema, and we'll see when you go to the exhibition, you'll see some of the early German films from the 20s and 30s being played in there. It's a modernism in all of its aspects. It's a true avant-garde, and getting to the primitive is one way of doing that. But it's not merely in the things being painted, in references to non-Western art. It's in the act of painting itself. So it's hard to convey this when looking at slides, but perhaps with a greatly blown up detail, you get a sense of just how violent the color and the form and the way of painting is. This is the farthest thing from the smooth, finished paintings of the classical tradition that you can imagine. And even I think the way that the eyes kind of drop out, this is infinitely clearer in the painting itself than it is in this slide, it almost seems as though all of this green paint is merely a mask over some other form of humanity in the case of this nude. It's something laid on the top by the artist that, or alternately, it's something to which the artist has stripped away the typical flesh of painting. There's something jagged in the very application of paint. It's you could say, a poke in the eye of the viewer, quite deliberately. That's the point of making the nude green. That's the point of breaking up form. That's even the point of the not all that careful attention to anatomy that you see in this three-fingered woman with the rubber arms, which is slightly overemphasized in this slide. They're not worried about that sort of thing. And it's not just Pechstein. If you look at his close companion and the true leader of Die Brücke, Ernst Kirchner, you see just the same thing. Now, one aspect of the exhibition is that, well, there are three parts to the exhibition, you could say. There are the new works coming from the Kondon-Giesberger bequest. There are those works primarily from the Walbridge and Grant collections that we've had before. And then to supplement these, we've borrowed 9 paintings from the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid, with which we have this ongoing relationship. As many of you know, we've just sent a selection of our Indian paintings to Madrid, where they were received to great acclaim. In return, we now have these 9 paintings from the Thyssen. So we have in the bequest 3, I'm showing 2 of them, but 3 great drawings by Ernst Kirchner. We don't own a painting by him, so it left is a painting from the Thyssen, which you'll also see in the exhibition. And it's the most banal thing imaginable. It's a few trees on a grassy slope. Yet, in the very way it's painted, these slashes of paint, these bright colors, colors that are almost clashing in the eye, you see how the stuff of painting is more important. The application, the means is more important than the object being painted. Now, Kirchner's about much more than just jagged strokes of paint, although that is maybe the word most often applied to his art. Jagged, broken, rough, faceted. He is also the ringleader, you might say, of Die Brücke and of the earliest years of Expressionism. The movement is centered in his studio, which was everything you might ever imagine a bourgeois artist, a bohemian artist studio to be. Clothing was strictly optional, and it seems not very often worn, particularly by the women in the circle. There are an infinite number of stories about the, let's say, slightly relaxed attitude towards the sexual mores of the time in the studio. There were apparently a great number of cats there as well, as also is the case for Gustav Klimt, who used to let his cats use his old drawings for litter paper. That's an aside that maybe gets beyond the point. But in that studio of Kirchner, with these nude friends of theirs walking around, figure drawing is one of the key elements. And you see that in these drawings, which are resolutely not nudes in the academic sense. These are not nymphs and Venuses. These are naked girls sitting around in a domestic interior that everyone at the time would have known was Kirchner's studio. That it's meant to be confrontational. It's meant to be art that makes the viewer uncomfortable. And that their lifestyle, this bohemian lifestyle, which I think in many ways exceeds even our most wild imaginings of what's going on in Montmartre in the previous generation, their wildlife is an aspect of their art itself. And this is caught up in Kirchner's drawings, these nudes, or rather, we should really call them naked studies, of which these are two of very many. We'll come back to the nude at some length. As Die Brücke is getting started with its wild forms, its bright color, its wild color, I think they would have used the word wild, inspired by the fauves in France, Matisse, Flamanck, and others, who are called fauves, meaning wild beasts. At the same time, you have something very similar happening, not in northern Germany, but down south, in Bavaria, in Munich, and then in the small town of Murnau, where Alexei Jelensky and Vasily Kandinsky, two Russians who left Russia to go find a more avant-garde art world, breaking free of the conventionalism of the Russian art establishment, team up with Franz Marc and Gabriele Munter, two Germans, and in the summer of 1908 and going into 1909, work side by side and transform their painting into something completely new. And you can see this in this exhibition by comparing this early, from 1905, landscape by Jelensky, in which he's still basically a low-grade impressionist churning out a kind of Manet or maybe even Loos-inspired snow scene. And suddenly, 3 years later, you're getting these flat, bright planes of color. You're not trying to convey atmosphere and light. It's as though the forms, the objects in the paintings, or the paint material itself has become important in a way that it wasn't here in these earlier pictures. And this idea that might just seem like art criticism is backed up by the abundant writings of Kandinsky, Jelensky, and others. They're very concerned that people understand that what they're doing, it has a spiritual underpinning, a theoretical spiritual underpinning, that looking at a picture and having an almost visceral reaction to that is like listening to the work of music or hearing or reading a great piece of literature. That art is meant to move you by the thing, not by the thing that it's representing. They constantly make reference to music because it's a non-representational art. Kandinsky writes his great treatise concerning the spiritual art a couple of years later. But in that first flush, 1908, 1909, you see everything change. Especially, I think, in these two works. On the left, a painting of the small town of Murnau by Kandinsky, and at right, a painting from the small town of Tutzing, not far away, by Gabriele Munter, works that we think are painted within a few weeks of each other in September of 1908. And you begin to see how the colors, the forms are the key thing. Almost certainly Murnau did not have houses painted in these bright colors. It was a very traditional, old-fashioned town. Certainly there are a few trees anywhere that look quite like these. The art is taking over. They're pushing forward. Now, this is very much like what the Fauves are doing in France. It's very much like what Die Brücke is doing up in Dresden and Berlin, although it has a slightly different emphasis. Nonetheless, we're able to lump them together because by 1910, they're exhibiting together, Die Brücke and the Blaue Reiter, and they recognize that they're both trying to transform the way people see art and see the world. One of the things that maybe makes German Expressionism a bit different from French art of the time is this, I think it's safe to say, more political sense, this more confrontational sense than you necessarily get in the work of someone like Matisse. At right, you see the Red Blossom by Jelensky, a work that's been in the museum collection since 1972 as part of Earl Grant's collection. We've reframed it, taking it out of its rather ugly American fake French-style frame and putting it in a new frame that is of the style preferred by the German Expressionists and typically used for German Expressionist pictures. We've done a lot of that kind of reframing, rematting. A number of works were cleaned to present them in the show. So if some things look different, that will be part of the reason why. Jelensky, too, pushing forward like Pechstein, dissolving form. He's not trying to create a portrait here. He's not trying to show you what this woman looked like. He's simply using it as a kind of inspiration. And if you think about comparing Jelensky in 1910 to, say, a typical Matisse of the time, you see how the French artists almost look conventional or timid by comparison. There's something aggressive about the German expressionists that I think we respond to differently from the way that we look at French painting of the time. Anyway, with these two big starting points introduced in the exhibition's first two sections, we then move to the thematic sections, and things, you might say, heat up a bit. When you get to a section entitled The Nude and Sex, and you see that right from those first works by Kirchner, nudity and the drawing of naked people in ordinary situations, situations that, however, haven't necessarily been the mainstay of artists, is a big part of what these artists is about. It's part of their shock tactics, if you will. So you see here at left a painting by Georg Tappert of a woman named Betty, clad only in her shoes and rolled down stockings, carrying a fan to give a suggestion that she is not simply wandering around her bedroom with shoes and socks on, but is it rather on stage. And in fact, it turns out that Betty was an exotic dancer. She was also Tappert's mistress for a while and the model for a series of paintings he makes around the year 1910, 1912. Tappert's not a well-known artist, but he's a key figure because at a certain point, the Brücke artists are told they can no longer exhibit with the old secessionist movement in Berlin. They're just too far out there. So Tappert starts a neue Secession, a new secession, and he invites the Blauer Reiter to come exhibit. He kind of brings the two branches of the movement together, and that creates a kind of kinetic energy that really makes things jump forward in the following years. You also see down at the bottom a watercolor by Erich Heckel and a print, a woodcut by Carl Schmidt-Rottluff. These also two guys who are hanging around, not surprisingly, in Kirchner's studio with all the naked girls. I think you have to emphasize, though, when looking at German Expressionism, that it's not simply a movement where oil paintings are the completion of every scheme. Partly because these artists are so poor, they're not interested and not terribly successful at selling their works. They don't have materials to paint, but also they're interested in, for all of their avant-garde sense, connecting up to the great age of German art as they see it, which is the late Middle Ages leading up to and stopping with Dürer. It's not so different from, say, British pre-Raphaelitism, which likes art up to and including Raphael and then dismissing everything since, at least theoretically. So too, the Expressionists, they're connecting to that great age of Albrecht Dürer. They're looking at the great Gothic woodcuts of the end of the 15th century and then rejecting everything that comes after, and then trying to combine that with some influences from France, Cubism, Fauvism. I think you get a sense looking at the face in this slightly blurry image of Erich Heckel's kneeling nude. Again, those masks that we see from African art. But it's exactly contemporary with Picasso's attempt to use these things. It's not as though this is only an emulation of Picasso. It's almost a contemporary discovery of that new way of seeing. And then, of course, at top, one of the greatest of the works, one of the most important of the works, one of the most difficult works that would otherwise be the most difficult to acquire, this great drawing of two women lying on the couch by Egon Schiele, part of that amazing series of erotic drawings that he creates that on the one hand get Schiele in trouble. He's accused of offending public morals, he's accused of public indecency, he's accused of perverting underage models, he's accused of pornography. On the other hand, these drawings are some of the most tender depictions of love, much more tender than those rather rough images you see in the works of Kirchner, for example. And it's as though Schiele is deliberately playing that edge of, why is this stuff so confrontational to you? Most people at the time, of course, don't get it. Schiele is brought to trial a number of times on charges of pornography, as indeed is Otto Dix, who makes drawings like this watercolor of a sailor in a black nude. Now, Dix loved the image of the sailor. He used it again and again. Here are two others. The sailor was, for Otto Dix, the very antithesis of your button-down, high-collared, three-piece suit and tie-wearing German burgher. The sailor was the opposite of that. He didn't have to obey laws of society. He wasn't bound by convention. The sailor on leave is subject to free license. The sailor is, to a certain point, what the artists of German Expressionism want to be, but also have a kind of fear of, because they don't want license to be, or they don't want liberty to be pure license. And when accused of pornography, Dix defends himself at trial by saying, no, you don't understand. The feeling I was trying to incite by these drawings is exactly the opposite of lust. This is not pornography, it's the opposite of pornography. I'm trying to show how sex and nudity have become commodities in this crazy society of Germany between the wars. This drawing is done in 1922. For all of the images of nudity and of sex, there's this sort of feeling that no, things are not quite right, that the great wild world, the high life of Weimar Germany, that we all think of in association with things like Christopher Isherwood's book or the movie Cabaret, yes, it's being recorded by these guys, but not without some sense that maybe the world has gone a little bit too mad, that this isn't really the reaction against the bourgeois society that we're intending to create. You get that sense, perhaps even more, in this amazing print by George Gross entitled Lechery, in which I think lechery itself has been personified. Another one of these good German burghers in his high-collared shirt, smoking a cigarette, drinking a glass of wine, with a leering glance at this prostitute undressing. The burgher, though, has been transformed into this kind of reptilian, snake-like creature. He has ceased to be the man of modern manners and morals and convention, and he's become this beast. And therein, I think you begin to understand why we've entitled the exhibition The Human Beast. Again and again, these artists are interested in depicting not conventions of society, but the most primal, the most animal of human instincts. If it's not clear enough with lechery personified in the reptilian beast, this image, which has been in some ways the poster child for the show, I think makes it even clearer. And this moves us to the next section of the exhibition about the horror of war. Just as Expressionism is really getting going, just as Die Brücke and the Blaue Reiter are really beginning to exhibit together, work together, to form this kind of symbiotic relationship in Berlin, the war comes along. And there's this ambivalence about the war. On the one hand, you have people like Otto Dix who go running to volunteer, to be part of the war effort, although we'll return to that in a second. You have others like Kirchner who are from the start objectors to the war and who instead are made to serve as medics, as nurses' aides and medics. Everyone was pressed into service. Virtually every one of these artists served in the war, went to the trenches in some capacity or other. Franz Marc and August Macke are both killed in the trenches in the early years of the war. Kirchner has a kind of nervous breakdown and is sent to Switzerland to recover. Otto Dix, though, signs up in 1914, and as he explains in a letter of the time, well, I signed up immediately, but it's less out of, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was less out of a support for the fatherland. It was less out of a kind of rampant nationalism, as in a need for me, the realist, to experience the rush of battle. I needed to know what it was like with the bombs going off. I needed to know what it was like when a man next to me was shot down and splattered his blood on my trousers as he fell. Poor Otto Dix had maybe read a little bit too much Friedrich Nietzsche. As if there were any question about this, we can refer to a series of other works done around this time. So the Lion Cannoneers from 1914, as is this self-portrait, and it's in fact a double-sided work. On one side, the self-portrait with a shaved head of the new recruit craning his neck around, ready for battle. That should remind you, or certainly reminded Dix of this work, his own bust of Nietzsche, a sculpture that Dix himself had made of his great hero figure, Friedrich Nietzsche. But you realize quickly that Dix has a slight ambivalence, that maybe after that initial rush of volunteering and his training as an artilleryman, maybe the war isn't going to work out so well. So you see him already somewhat dehumanized, turned into this kind of monster of war with the shaved head and this craning neck. You see him now, again, as another self-portrait in his uniform, sort of in the black, sinking down into this mud of battle. Or this self-portrait done, it's odd, it has the date 1914 and then 1915 written over it, so slightly later than the other two, which Dix entitles Self-Portrait as a Target, as if to realize that, he's a gunner, but there are going to be people gunning for him as well. This returns us to our friend, the cannoneer Löwe, the lion cannoneer. Löwe, the German word, is this man's name, but it's also the word for lion. So playing on this pun, Dix has transformed this man into this kind of feline beast, this lion-like beast, and I think the implication is clear. War has dehumanized this man. It has turned him into a beast, that he's lost his own identity and he's become part of this horrendous war effort. And it's fascinating, too, thinking of the spirituality of color and the power of color that's so much a part of German Expressionism, to contrast the hot orange here, which we immediately read as the glow of battle, with those black holes into which Dix is sinking as a kind of target, as the opposite of the aggressor in those two other self-portraits. One of the other great works dealing with the First World War, and one of the other loans to the exhibition, but the only loan not from the Thyssen, this is from a local collection, is Ernst Barlach's The Avenger, one of the great works of German Expressionist sculpture. Barlach first makes this figure in 1914, just as the war is beginning, and it is interpreted by some scholars as Barlach supporting the war effort. That is to say, no one could stop the onward rushing of the German army. Barlach, though, may not have meant something so simple. In his letters of the time, he refers to this as the Berserk Man. Hardly seems like the glory of battle. And then more to the point, having made the figure first in 1914, he returns to it in 1922, carves a new wood version of the figure and casts a bronze from that, and it's the 1922 bronze, which we have in the exhibition. By this time, Barlach had become the most important creator of the war memorials. But all of his memorials are in the tone of, and this should never happen again. That war was awful. War was a disaster. It should never happen again. The lives that were lost, the conditions, for as much as was changed, he is one of the most outspoken opponents of war, although he is being commissioned for all of the major war memorials of the time. Very few of these survive. The Nazis later on deemed these to be un-German in sentiment. Obviously, war should never happen again was an unpopular sentiment with the National Socialist Party. And Barlach becomes a kind of public criminal in the following decade. But in 1922, he makes this second cast of the Avenger, as if to clarify that, no, this is not about the glory of war. This is the terror of war. This is man gone berserk, man stripped of his better feelings and becoming this beast, and emphasizing instead his bestial nature. The war is the predominant event for the history of Expressionism. There's a kind of before and after, and everyone responds to it in one or another way. A number of artists, though, rather than making images about the war itself, retreat from it and instead take on the subject of landscape, as if to show the world before the war started, or an escape from the modern machine, the modern city and technological machine that would give rise to war and Germany's ambitions. And one of those people is Egon Schiele. Now, everyone knows Schiele's erotic drawings, but he's also an important landscape painter, and one of his real masterpieces is this large painting from the Thyssen, one of their most important paintings, which is also here for the exhibition. And it's called The Houses on the River, or The Old Town. It seems to have been, Schiele seems to have used both titles. When things got a little bit problematic for Schiele because of his erotic drawings and his wild lifestyle that went along with them, he left Vienna and went to the small town of Krumau in what's now the Czech Republic, which was the place his mother had been born. And this was an old-fashioned medieval town that time had literally left behind. It was an old Middle European village on the banks of the Moldova River. And he thinks he's going to be able to settle down here, really pursue his art without the distractions of the modern world. Unfortunately, the citizens of Krumau didn't really think that that bohemian lifestyle that went along with Schiele's art fit their town, and he was literally run out of town. But a couple of years later, as Germany and Austria are sliding into war, he begins painting images like this one. And it's as though this is the world that is about to be lost. These are the landscapes that are going to be destroyed. This old world, this town that had survived from the Middle Ages until now, basically untouched, is about to be destroyed. And you get the sense of a completely depopulated town. There's something eerie in that landscape, as though it's a dead town, you could say. It's also something very modern in the way he skewed perspectives and flattened these forms. It looks cubist in a way, although Schiele explains much of his inspiration at this moment comes from stained glass windows. So again, just as we have Die Brucke looking at non-Western art, just as we have Gabriele Munter looking at folk art, now we have Schiele looking at stained glass windows of the Middle Ages, an attempt to find in old art a new vision, something that breaks from the classical tradition, something that gets back to something that's more pure, more elemental, less constrained by conventionality. One of the great landscape series painted during the war, and in a way in response to the war, though, is that of Alexei Jelensky, his so-called Variations on a Landscape series. Jelensky's a Russian. He's in Germany when the war begins. He's told he has 2 days to get out of the country. He basically picks up in the middle of the night and leaves with what he can carry, and he flees to Switzerland. But even there, he's a suspect character, a Russian who's been living in Germany. He can't go wander the hills. He can't go into town. He's more or less confined to this little cottage. And he can only paint. He has one small room where he can paint, and in that room is one small window with, as he describes it, a few trees, a path, and occasionally a view of hills in the distance. And Jelensky, who was a great writer, explained in an autobiographical account later on, I wanted to get back to painting those bold, strong pictures, things like that red portrait known as Red Blossom that I showed earlier, but I just couldn't. The time for those had passed. I needed instead to look for something more spiritual, something that could inspire me. And I looked out my window and I began painting that landscape again and again and again. And there are literally hundreds of canvases of the view out of that window, which he later on called songs without words. These are meditations on a theme. These are songs without words. And what he's getting at is not an understanding of the things of the landscape, but instead of painting itself. Now, on the left is one of the first paintings in that series, the large variation of 1915, work that, to give you an example, an indication of its importance, has been to Europe 3 times in the last 5 years for exhibitions. It's such a key step on the road towards pure abstraction. And that was the work that inspired Vance Kondon to begin collecting Expressionism when he saw it in the Walbridge collection. We're now able to juxtapose that painting with the one on the right from Vance Kondon's collection, painted 4 years later in 1919 at the end of his Landscape Variations series. And immediately, I hope, you begin to recognize that we're still looking out that window in Saint-Pré in Switzerland. These two forms are the 2 cypress trees. This large leaning tree here is this form. The path curling away in the distance has become a series of shapes. These pictures about the art of painting, these songs without words, or as Kandinsky said when questioned about his art, don't worry about whether you can understand what it is or not. Just ask whether you have been moved by the picture, and that's all enough. That's what Jelensky is trying to get at in this series of meditations on art at a time when he can almost not create art because of the war. But here's where it gets even better. We now have these 2 landscapes from the Walbridge and Kondon collection from the landscape variation series painted between 1915 and 1920, or 1919. When that ended, Ulenski then began painting a series of heads. And he said, I needed a new subject, something to which I could bring not just spirituality, but true religious feeling. And for that, I could only use the human face. It's the human face, he said, of the idols of my Russian childhood. He's essentially painting the face of God, the face of Christ, as remembered. And again, go to the stained glass windows, go to the African masks. Now we're throwing Russian icons into it. And we're able to juxtapose with the two landscape variations, two paintings from Earl Grant's collection from the beginning of the Abstract Head series, and then a much later meditation. And you see again how he's trying to understand what painting itself is all about. He's moving down the same road that we find Kandinsky moving on as we get from his early colored woodcuts, where you still see the riders. Remember, this is the Blauer Rider. These are the riders of the Blue Rider name. And you see the rider here, and these are all prints from a series of which are still bound in a volume. You can only see this one in the exhibition. But you see this evolution from recognizable forms to a rider here starting to disappear in these colored blocks, in a black and white print, something that's pretty much purely abstract, and then bringing the color back into it. This will give birth, these from 1913, will give birth by the 20s to the purely abstract Kandinskys, such as this loan from the Thyssen. So to be able to juxtapose that, or to trace Ulenski's career from its beginnings, well, I don't even have the very early painting, the Impressionist style painting here, through the beginnings of Expressionism and the move towards abstraction. This gives you an idea of now the richness and the density of our collection. And it's nice how we have here 3 paintings, 1, 2, 3 from the Grant collection, 1 from the Walbridge, and now the Kondon collection added to this, and how the bequests build on one another and build the museum's collection. Kandinsky and Ulenski and many others are escaping from their anxiety about the modern world by slipping into abstraction, slipping into this spiritual kind of painting. Another reaction or another retreat from the modern world, from the war and the world that follows, is into the world of fantasy. And here's where we see their colleague at the Bauhaus School, Kandinsky, Ulenski, and Paul Klee, all taught at the Bauhaus School, this school of design intended to teach not just the fine arts, but design, how to bring the ideas of spirituality into everyday life. Klee is making what would probably be called surrealism if it were done in France. He's making nonsense. He's making the fantastic child, as he calls this drawing, or this work entitled The March to the Summit, in which a monocled man marches to the top of a mountain playing a bagpipe and accompanied by his dog and some other object that we can't quite make out. It's nonsense. It doesn't add up to anything like so many surrealist pictures. It's as if to say, the modern condition and all of its technology, it doesn't add up to anything. It doesn't explain anything at all. These are all a retreat from the modern world. These are the artists of a slightly older generation, though. And just as these pictures are being done, we begin to see the third phase of Expressionism, the movement known as the Neue Sachlichkeit, the new objectivity, headed off by Max Beckmann on the left or George Grosz on the right. And they say, enough with this abstraction, enough with this fantasy. If we want to make pictures that truly address the modern world, we need to go back to old-fashioned realism, because only that can make people see what the world is really like. And so you get, for example, Max Beckmann's print known as the Tauentzien Palace, after the hotel and lounge, the bar in the hotel, with this kind of burlesque show going on. Or George Grosz's painting in the exhibition on loan from the Thyssen of Kurfürstendamm, the boulevard in Berlin, in which we see our fat German burgher smoking a cigar, this dandy of a man smoking a cigarette and carrying his cane, walking down the boulevard and ignoring this half-blind and crippled veteran of the war. This several years after the war, and there were thousands and thousands of these veterans who had nowhere to go, homeless, jobless veterans. And this contrast between that wild life of the cabaret culture and the true condition of so much of the working class and those soldiers gets us back to that concern with social commentary and getting away from just that high bourgeois appreciation of art that was at the movement's very beginnings, but now with a very different style coming to bear. In doing so, Beckmann and Gross are very much inspired by one of the other key figures of Expressionism, and that's Katja Kollwitz. And we have, I think, 6 prints by her, or 5 prints and a bronze relief by her in the exhibition. These are the 2 most important of the prints. At left, this amazing, brutally honest self-portrait. I think she was 53 years old at the time that she made this, and it's a kind of no-holds-barred, closely cropped self-portrait of the sort that only the most honest artist could imagine making. It goes back to that woodcut, that rough woodcut technique of the later Middle Ages and Dürer. And like Dürer, Kollwitz is a master printmaker. This self-portrait, which you would think would be a kind of quickly captured image, exists in 12 different states. 12 known changes to the woodblock along the way until she was satisfied with the image. And our print is an interesting early proof state, and this thing was bought for the museum in 1945, incidentally, which are invisible in the slide, of course, retouching in the cheek and a bit up here, indications of changes that she wanted to make to the block in subsequent states. Likewise, the large print at the right of this head of a working woman is a proof state for this poster for the German home cottage industry exhibition of 1906. And it said that this image of a working woman was so powerful that when it was plastered all over Berlin, the empress, who was supposed to go and be this ceremonial honorific opening, cut the ribbon for this exhibition, she couldn't bear to face the exhibition and the people who'd be there because she was so disturbed by this image on the walls of Berlin's buildings leading up to the show. So that return to an addressing of the modern world, but now with a realism that's very different from the expressionist colors, the wild colors of the first years. Kollwitz is the inspiration. Gross is the one who takes this farthest down the road, going beyond social commentary into what I think can only be called a sort of biting satire. 2 more prints, and again, these are the sorts of thing that Vance Kondon relished and that, Mrs. Walbridge didn't quite appreciate and never collected. The print at left, and I don't mean to make fun of Mrs. Walbridge, it's kind of an easy target. My point is just how these different collectors filled out different parts of the movement as a whole. At left, a print known as The Girl from Leipzig, this girl from the country, so to speak, who's come to Berlin, and she may dress up pretty, but she can't hide the fact that she's just a prostitute after all. Or right, an even more damning print entitled Christian Society, in which you see, again, our German monocled burgher in his high collar, surrounded by these women whom he has undressed with his eyes, not to mention the fact that this one is perhaps a nun or a widow with her cross and Bible. These middle-aged women in their very respectable hats, even these have become sexualized objects in this horrific modern society, which is all about money and sex in George Gross's view. It's things like this that lead Gross to be branded by the National Socialists cultural Bolshevist #1. Things do begin to get ugly when the Nazi Party comes into power. The Nazis do not like things modern. They want to go back to a Germany. Perhaps it's partly because many of them are from the South. Partly it's just conservatism. They want to go back to the Germany of beer halls and women in dirndls. That wild life of Berlin is corruption personified. What is more, though, is the Nazis, instead of just sort of choosing to patronize only traditional artists, actually go out of their way to belittle the modern artists. And in 1937, hold this now infamous degenerate art, the Antarctica Kunst exhibition in Berlin, and then it travels around the country. Or degenerate art, as you see, in quotation marks. So even the cover of the program kind of making fun. And here we see Hitler arriving, and you see in the exhibition the paintings are hung at crazy angles. There are comments written up on the walls. Is this really art? Is the gist of many of them. And this included a kind of who's who of German and French modernism. These included some of the most amazing pictures by people like Van Gogh or Kandinsky. Here you see a Kandinsky on the wall. It's not the same picture, but you get a sense of how it's another one of these variations. Stacked on the table, a whole series of these busts by Wilhelm Lehmbruck, who once upon a time had been like Barlach, seen as a great German hero, a maker of monuments, and who is completely dismissed. This is the one in the exhibition, and I believe it's the same bust, which exists in several versions that you see on the table there. With the rise of the Nazi Party, Expressionism effectively comes to an end because the artists are literally not allowed to work. They're initially not allowed to sell their art. Then they are told they cannot even produce more art. So Emil Nolde, through much of the 30s, becomes a watercolor painter because he's been told he's not allowed to paint. And to work in oil paint, the smell of that would give him away were anyone to come storming into his house, whereas watercolors, like this beautiful late watercolor that's in the exhibition, could be hidden away if necessary. The artists scatter. Max Beckmann goes to Amsterdam. Barlach becomes a kind of public criminal. Katja Kollwitz, who dies in 1945, becomes a kind of heroine for her defense of Barlach and her own decision not to produce art as a response to this for a while. George Gross winds up fleeing Germany and coming to America. And you see at the right this amazing large watercolor, his view of Broadway in New York City, in which he tries to give a sense of the bright lights in the big city, and you get to see he really wants to like America, but he can't quite snap himself out of it. As he said in a letter of the time, I wanted to make America look good, but I just couldn't help myself. I found that most of the people I painted were middle-aged and uglier than I intended them to be. But by the time he leaves in 1934, by the time that Kirchner kills himself in 1938, the movement has effectively ended. Those artists who remain are not producing or are scattered. They're not a movement anymore. The Nazis destroy a huge amount of art, but they also confiscate much of this modern art and sell it to the degenerate French and Americans to raise money for the Reich, because the Americans and the French are delighted to pay lots of money for these crazy pictures, which are not allowed to be exhibited even in private homes. It's a case where the story, in a way, has come full circle. From artists who began by trying to stick their finger in the eye of the bourgeois, now being prohibited by a kind of new, deeply bourgeois movement in its way, which is what the National Socialist Party was, from producing their art. It brings Expressionism as we know it to an end. And it brings us to the end of the exhibition as well. But in telling that whole story, and as I say, virtually every work that I've shown you tonight is in the exhibition, and only a handful of them are loans. We now have this more or less complete, amazingly complete collection of German Expressionism here at the San Diego Museum. And as though this seems like it should be a great surprise, and the German cultural attaché who was here last night couldn't believe that he could find such a part of Germany here in Southern California, in fact, it's not coincidence. Because when the Nazis begin, for example, trying to close down the Bauhaus school, Galka Schreier buys up a cache or collects a cache of work by Jelensky, Kandinsky, Lionel Feininger, Paul Klee, and others, and brings them to America, and brings them not to the East Coast, the establishment East Coast, but all the way to California, feeling that here out in the great new world of California, there would be a ready audience for that kind of art, which there was. And a number of the works that are in the exhibition from the Kondon or Walbridge collections had been brought over from Germany by Galka Schreier, sold to someone, and then sold to the collectors here in San Diego. It's for this same reason that you get the great collections at the Pasadena Art Museum, Galka Schreier's own collection. Unfortunately, once Norton Simon took over the Pasadena Art Center, much of the German Expressionism was displaced from the walls because of the way that Norton Simons need always to be shown, so there's only a small rotating selection, but an incredibly rich cache of this material at the Norton Simon, formerly the Pasadena Art Museum. Likewise, you have at the LA County Museum, the Rifkin Center, one of the most complete collections of German Expressionist prints anywhere in the world. California was a kind of natural home, and even some of these artists, Feininger, for example, flees Germany and winds up teaching at Mills College in Oakland. California becomes the new world for much of this material. So it's not a coincidence that we should have so much here in San Diego. But now, seeing it all on the walls, it is nonetheless, I think, an amazing collection and something that the city and the museum should be proud to have. Thank you.